The name that won't die, Prussia, a word whispered in military history, etched on old maps, and buried under modern nations. But who were the Prussians? What was their world like before it was rewritten by conquest? There are countries that live in textbooks, and then there are names that haunt maps like ghosts. Prussia, a nation erased by borders, yet resurrected every time a war strategy is studied or a soldier marches in perfect step. It is a name whispered in the corridors of military academies and barely spoken at all in the lands it once ruled. But who were the Prussians? Not the empire builders of Bismarck or the generals of Berlin, but the people whose bones rest beneath Baltic soil, whose gods were older than Rome, whose language has no living echo. How does a nation vanish so completely and yet continue to shape the world from the shadows? Today we unearth the memory of a forgotten civilization, not a footnote in German history, but a foundation, one that was hunted, broken, absorbed, yet left fingerprints on everything from modern statecraft to sacred amber trade routes. This is the story of Prussia, the history that changed Europe and the name that refuses to die. By the winter of 1871, Europe had a new empire, but it bore an old name. Germany was born under the steel logic of Otto von Bismarck, but its cradle was not Saxony or Bavaria. It was a land whose people no longer existed. Prussia, a kingdom led by men who spoke German, but wore the bones of a vanished tribe like armor. Its black eagle flew from Berlin to Königsberg, a symbol of power, law, and obedience. But few asked where that eagle came from, or what it replaced. The modern Prussian state was an empire of structure. It exported an ethic, work as worship, war as precision. It gave Europe something terrifyingly new, a nation that ran like a mechanism. Schools became factories for citizens. Churches were bound to state loyalty. And the army? A body of living doctrine, built not for chaos, but coordination. This wasn't Rome. It wasn't France. It was something colder, something cleaner, something more dangerous. An experiment in statecraft in which emotion was measured and identity was assigned by duty, not birth. But here's the paradox history rarely speaks of. The Kingdom of Prussia, this ruthless engine of German unification, took its name from a people it had already erased. The original Prussians were not Germans. They weren't even Christian. They didn't build empires. They whispered to gods beneath trees. So why did Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, wrap his empire in their name? What was it about the lost tribe of the Baltic that made it useful to the new architects of Europe? To understand this, we must go back, not to war, but to forest, not to Berlin, but to the sacred groves of Ramave. You can tell the future of a people by their geography, or so the conquerors believed. The land the first Prussians called home was not central, not safe. It was the exposed shoulder of Europe, wedged between emerging giants, Slavic states to the south, Germans to the west, Lithuanians to the northeast. This place was not a crossroads. It was a frontier, flat, wet, forested. No mountains to block armies, no rivers deep enough to stop invaders, no capital city, no unified banner, just scattered clans who named their lands after rivers and trees. Animation Q, a time-lapse map showing tribal territories dissolving under pressure, borders pressing inward. From the modern eye, it seems inevitable, a people waiting to be overrun. But here's what the textbooks won't tell you. The Prussians were not passive. They held off foreign incursions for centuries, not with armies, but with alliances, sacred oaths, and deep-rooted terrain knowledge that made every forest a fortress. But terrain that protects also isolates. While others built kingdoms, the Prussians built memories, oral histories, groves instead of churches, spears instead of cavalry. Their strength was decentralized, their weakness was the same. And yet the greatest irony is this: the same open landscape that made them vulnerable would later become the perfect launch pad for a new kind of conquest. One not carried by the wind, but by the cross, before kingdoms, before crusades, before even the name. This was a land of whispering trees and gods without faces. The people we now call Prussians never called themselves that. Not at first. They were the Baltic tribes, kin to the Lithuanians and Latvians, not German, not Slavic. They lived at the edge of the known world, and to the Romans, they may as well have lived at the edge of time. In the 1st century CE, Tacitus mentioned them briefly. Asti, he wrote, strange coastal people who gathered amber and worshiped nature. To Rome, they were a footnote, but to themselves they were the center of an unseen world. Their gods did not live in temples. They lived in the forest, in the wind, in flame. Polo, lord of death, was not feared, but honored. Punas hurled thunder from unseen heights. Potempo ruled the tide and fed the fields. Their sacred center was Ramavi, a grove no man dared damage, a place where trees remembered everything. But perhaps the most haunting detail: we don't know what the Prussians called their gods. Not exactly. Most names we use today are reconstructed from missionary notes in German chronicles written after their fall. They had no writing system, no centralized court, no royal decree. Their memory was oral. Their priests, the Videlotas, held entire histories in their heads. But in a literate age, memory alone was not enough. Don't forget to subscribe for more documentaries that uncover hidden histories and forgotten empires. And this is where the tragedy begins. Because what they saw as sacred groves, their enemies would call pagan idolatry. And what they saw as balance, the church would call rebellion. The very forest that protected them would soon justify their extermination. The first war for Prussia was not for land. It was for the right to worship. Their lives were spent in the shadow of invaders. Yet in their own way, the Prussians were resilient, born of the land's unforgiving edge. Here at the edge of Europe, survival wasn't a luxury, it was an art, born out of the necessity of each dawn. Grain fed them, livestock clothed them, and amber, the Baltic gold, both glittered and promised prosperity, but it also marked them as a prize to plunder. Their economy was built on these fragile yet rich offerings, but none of it would last long enough to transform into a kingdom. Their society was woven not from stone or iron, but from kinship. Clans ruled, not kings. Elders, respected for their wisdom and age, governed in councils. Decisions based not on power, but on the weight of collective memory. It was a system based on trust, yet it was also one without defense beyond their immediate kin. Their weapons were simple: spears, axes, bows, light armor, often made of leather, rarely more. They didn't need heavy armament, not until their way of life was already in jeopardy. Defense was built into the land itself. The Prussians relied on alliances, often shifting, but always strategic. Woodlands became their fortresses, rivers their barriers. But these were all temporary solutions to an eternal problem. They were too scattered, too decentralized to mount a real defense. As long as they held the land, they could live by their rules. But the land was changing. Their own deep-rooted isolation would soon become their vulnerability. The tribes knew this. Every winter, every spring, each full moon was a reminder. They were living on borrowed time. And in the north, in the heat of Germanic power, the first threats were already brewing. Their defensive system was simple, and that was the problem. No centralized command, no real army. Instead, a reliance on swift alliances and the unpredictable, shifting nature of forest and river to protect them from the growing forces surrounding them. And that was their greatest flaw. But one thing the Prussians couldn't predict was how quickly the world was about to change. A language that once echoed in the Baltic woods now survives in fragments, in the grammar notes of priests, in dying prayers whispered by old women, and in the broken sentences scribbled in the margins of forgotten catechisms. The Prussian language, like its people, was a living thing once. It was a tongue of ancient memory, closely related to Lithuanian and Latvian, but older still, reaching back to the first peoples who walked the shores of the Baltic Sea. By the time the 16th century arrived, only a handful of written texts remained. The Elbing vocabulary, a modest dictionary, was one of the last attempts to capture a fading language. And alongside it, catechisms written in Old Prussian to Christianize the people, the first record of a language being reshaped, distorted, and finally consumed by another. But the real death of Old Prussian came centuries before the last words were written. Germanization was already tightening its grip in the 17th and 18th centuries. The language once spoken around hearths and groves was slowly strangled by the rise of the Prussian state. The Prussians, once proud of their tongue, were soon forced to speak a foreign language, one that was not just spoken, but legislated, enforced, and institutionalized. The death of their language wasn't just the death of a vocabulary, it was the death of identity. A language carries more than just words. It carries a people's dreams, their fears, their history. The words of Polo, Punas, and Potempo faded from memory, replaced by foreign tongues. As the last speakers of Old Prussian died, their culture, their story, was wiped away. What remained were only fragments. In the dying light of the 12th century, the Prussian forest grew quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the breath before the blade. The Prussian lands, low-lying, forested, amber-rich, were bordered by ambition. Not yet a country, not quite a cause. It was a land of clans and firelight, where tribal councils debated omens as much as raids. But the world beyond them had changed. The Polish Piast dynasty, baptized and rising, no longer saw Prussia as a neighbor. It was a mission. Bohemian warlords tied to Western Christendom saw in Prussia the pagan void, a realm to civilize. Lithuanian dukes, still pagan but expanding fast, competed for territory. Even among their cultural cousins, each neighbor had their own map, and none of them showed Prussia surviving intact. The Natangians, Sambians, Bartians, and Yotvingians held their lands with courage but no central will. Defense came in bursts, ambushes, guerrilla tactics, rapid retreats to sacred groves. Weapons were local, not mass-produced. Ash wood bows, black flint axes, boiled leather shields. They were fierce but finite. A Polish monk in 1198 wrote, "The Prussians resist like wolves, bravely but in packs, not armies. Their gods protect them, for now." By the end of the 12th century, faith and politics had merged into a weapon sharper than any blade. The church declared Prussia as mission land, and any blood spilled in conquest was righteous. Polish clergy, backed by dukes, framed war as salvation. Papal letters began referring to the lost tribes of the north. Amber, once a sacred good, became currency for piety. It wasn't just a conquest, it was branding the soil itself as Christian. From the west, a defeated force prepared to return, not to Jerusalem, but here. The Teutonic order, humiliated after the fall of Acre, was offered a new crusade, this time in the Baltic. But they wouldn't just fight, they would build. Rule, reforge the land. The Prussians had long lived among ghosts. They were about to meet one that wore armor. The last time the Prussians fought alone would be the first time they faced an enemy who would not leave. They came not for land, but for souls, and those who resisted were erased. In the year 1230, a crusade was launched, but this wasn't to Jerusalem. It was to the cold forests along the Baltic coast, a place untouched by cathedrals, a place where sacred groves whispered to gods no Christian had ever named. These were the lands of the old Prussians, pagan tribes whose ancestors had walked these woods since before the Romans counted time, and they were about to be erased. The man who opened the gates to their fate was Duke Conrad of Masovia, a Polish noble overwhelmed by Prussian raids and rebellion. Desperate, he summoned an exiled military order with a reputation for religious brutality, the Teutonic Knights. They arrived like a prophecy, cloaked in white, crosses on their chests, steel at their sides. Their mission? To baptize the heathens with water or with blood. They built castles where sacred trees once stood. They drew maps where tribal borders had never existed, and in place of firelit rituals, they brought the Latin tongue, Christian law, and military lawlessness. The knights weren't settlers. They were instruments. Behind every stone fortress was a cross. Behind every sermon, a sword. The Prussian gods, Polo, Punus, Pompo, were declared demons. The grove of Ramav, their holiest site, was torn down. Some trees were chopped and burned. Others quietly buried beneath new Christian chapels, an unspoken act of domination. The Vidalotas, their priesthood, vanished into the earth or into silence. Their chants stopped echoing through the pine. Thousands were forced into baptism, sometimes in rivers still stained with the blood of their elders. The Teutonic chroniclers would later write of the salvation of the Baltic, but those who watched their gods fall called it something else, extinction. But the Prussians did not vanish quietly. In 1260, after the Teutonic Knights suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of pagan Lithuanians at the Battle of Derby, hope was rekindled. From the shadows rose a man the knights never expected. Hercus Monte, a Prussian noble taken as a Christian hostage, raised in Magdeburg, now returned to lead a rebellion against the faith that raised him. He knew their language, he knew their tactics, and he burned with revenge. From 1260 to 1274, the Prussians fought like ghosts of the old world. They razed fortresses, wiped out outposts, shattered supply lines. It was called the Great Prussian Uprising, a firestorm the church never saw coming. In one ambush, Hercus is said to have taken back the skull of a fallen commander. A grisly trophy, a message written in silence. The uprising was crushed. The order responded with scorched earth. Whole villages disappeared from maps. Entire clans were rounded up and vanished. Their names, their stories, their bloodlines. By the end of the 13th century, the Prussians were no longer a people, only a name. They were conquered in faith, in language, in name, but not in legacy. Because something strange happened in the centuries that followed, the conquerors took their name and built a kingdom with it. From ashes and silence, a new Prussia would rise, forged by conquest, ruled by discipline, and destined to shake the very bones of Europe. But it would never be the Prussia that once danced beneath sacred trees. Number that, Prussia had died long before its name was crowned. The name that won't die was born from a people who could not survive. By the time Europe learned to fear Prussia, the Prussians were already gone. 1370s to 1500s. The Teutonic Knights didn't just conquer the land, they renamed it after their victims, not to honor them, but to erase them quietly. The term Prussia stopped referring to the Baltic tribes. It now referred to the administrative zones of a religious military regime. The original Prussians, their blood, gods, language, were nowhere in its courts, its armies, or its theology. They took the name, but not the people. To disappear is one thing. To vanish and yet be remembered incorrectly is another. By 1525, the Teutonic Order had collapsed. Albert of Brandenburg, a knight-turned-reformer, saw an opportunity, not for resurrection, but rebranding. He secularized the order and named the new duchy Prussia. It was the first Protestant state in Europe, but the god of thunder and the god of death, Punus and Polo, were now heretical myths. The name Prussia rose to power, but with no roots to claim it. By the 18th century, the Kingdom of Prussia was leading wars, setting military doctrine, and establishing bureaucratic rule admired across Europe. But no monument was ever built to the original tribes. No museum kept their relics. The elites of Berlin wore powdered wigs and recited Kant, unaware that the graves of the Isti were beneath their feet. It is a bitter irony that the most rational kingdom of our time carries a name from a people whose wisdom we never bothered to understand. So Prussia survived, but only in uniform. The soul was not preserved, only the steel was. Under Kaliningrad's streets, the silence of the Prussians still speaks, if you know where to listen. The city of Kaliningrad stands today as a graveyard for a civilization wiped from the pages of history. But buried deep under the Soviet concrete is the forgotten land of Königsberg, where centuries ago, the Prussian tribes once roamed. It wasn't just land that was stolen, it was a people. It was their gods, their language, and their very soul. What did it mean for a people to vanish? What happens to history when it is erased? In the archives of old Prussian catechisms, now decaying with age, lies the last breath of a language. Old Prussian, a language that was once sung in the groves of sacred trees and echoed over the Baltic waters. Now its syllables are fragments, its essence slipping away. Scholars struggle, but nobody speaks Old Prussian anymore. The last speaker? No one knows their name, but they were likely forgotten in the 1700s. The words of Polo, Punus, and Potempo fade in these pages, but the silence left by those who were converted remains. Was it truly conversion, or something worse, a cultural erasure? When language dies, does the culture it held within it follow? Or does it linger, buried beneath layers of power and domination? While Berlin boasts its monuments, Kaliningrad's museums house the shattered remains of Prussian religious life. Here in these glass boxes lie fragments of their sacred shrines. The grove of Ramave reduced to reconstructed idols and broken beads. Old Prussian religion wasn't just about gods. It was about relationships with the earth, with the forces of nature, and a belief in immortality that was wiped away, not by force alone, but by the imposition of foreign gods. A tear in time. That is what it feels like, wandering through Kaliningrad. The pristine language of the Prussians, silent, their sacred groves, uprooted. Amber beads no longer tell stories, they are silent witnesses. But did your Prussian culture die? Or did it merely hide, wearing the face of something it never was? History remembers the victors, but what if the silence that filled the void left by the Prussians is the loudest memory of all? Prussia's name survived. The lands became Germanized, rebranded as Prussia by the Teutonic Order. But what was Prussia? A military state? A forgotten tribe? Or simply a prison of identity long after its people were gone? History doesn't always tell us the whole truth. Sometimes it forgets. But what if we're still living in the shadow of something that was lost, but never truly gone? Fascinated by Prussia's lost legacy? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Hit like if this story surprised you, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold histories that shaped our world.